In this video, we're going to proceed to look at the M in MVC, which is the model. So we're going to look at the dependency injection and the repository pattern. Dependency injection. I see a lot of people tremble when they hear this word, but you shouldn't, or at least this video will show you that. Now, you see that it's two words coming together. The first word is dependency. That means to rely on something. The next word is injection, which means to put into something. So essentially what we're doing is we're taking the things that something relies on and we're putting into. Okay, that's just dependency injection, bare minimum. Now, when I look at DI, I think of transparency. I think of you're trying to declare your assets. You're trying to say that for me to function, I will need these things that I depend on. Hence the transparency. You need to tell us beforehand what you need. You have to declare your assets. Okay? Now let's go to a diagram, a class diagram, to show it more. Now, for instance, you have a functionality in your application that registers a class. Okay? Now, for you to register somebody to a class, you need to have the details of the student and also the details of the module that they want to register, right? So here we have the student class that has details for a student, and we have the module class that has details of the modules. So we've got this class that we intend to give it functionality to register a student. Now, for this class to function, it will need that class, the student class. It also need the module class. Okay, so it will need an instance of these two classes for it to function. Hence, these two classes become its dependencies. All right. Now, when we want to create an instance of this class, we have to give it those two dependencies. So the act of giving it those dependencies is called dependency injection. Let's see a little bit of code here. All right. So in C#, this is what you do ideally. Right? You're going to new up an instance of that class, which it depends on. We'll new up an instance of the module class, which it depends on. Then the class register here has to declare its assets. For me to function, all I need is two classes, which is module and student. And once we declare that, we're going to initialize these instances. So what we're doing here is what we call constructor dependency injection. So we're saying, fine, there you go. So by giving it these two things and it newing it up, well, we have done what we call dependency injection. Okay, we could talk about this the whole day, but I'll show you in code how it's implemented. But just think of it as just declaring your assets, just giving it what it depends. Now, dependency injection has, I think, in general, three advantages. First of all, you can reuse code. You will see it as we get to the coding part. Ease of refactoring, very easy. Ease of testing, we're going to do this later on in the course, but you will see all these three things in action since this is a practical series. Okay. The next part that we need when it comes to models, we need to have what we call the repository pattern. All right, and don't let that diagram scare you. We're gonna digest it in a bit. Now, in programming, there are things that I call constants, things that will never change. For instance, your API here most likely has to talk to a data storage. Could be a database, could be a cache, could be in memory, but an API has to talk to a data storage somewhere. That's a constant. All right, that will never change. That's an interaction that APIs have. But there are what I call variables, right? These are things that change. And what do I mean by that? There's entity framework here. This is one of the ways that you can use to access your database. Okay, so you can say, you know what, for me to access that database, I will use entity framework. It will work. Somebody might say, no, you know what, I want to use Dapper, and this is a gift from guys from Stack Overflow, a very lightweight ORM. So these two are what we call object-oriented mappers. So they give us access to talk to the database. So one could use entity framework, the other person could use Dapper. So these are variables, right? Now, we want to be developers that build software that's maintainable, that's concise, that's highly decoupled. That's where the repository pattern comes into play. Now, what most developers do is they will couple the entity framework so hard to the model that when something happens, for instance, there's been a breach in entity framework, God forbid, and we have to leave entity framework and go to Dapper. What that means is you have to break up everything for you to use Dapper. Okay, now that works, but that's poor design. And as developers, we don't want to build that. We want, if something happens to entity framework, the next day we can just switch to Dapper effortlessly. And this is achieved by using the repository pattern. And the question might be, so what do we use? All right, there's a savior here. It's called an interface. Now, an interface is more or less like a class, but the difference is an interface doesn't have implementation of the methods that it demands. So an interface will just be a contract. It will tell you, if you inherit from me, then I want you to give me the following functionalities. Okay, in our case, we want to have these 5 functions, which include getting all prescriptions, getting a single prescription, creating one, and all of this. So an interface will only state what functionality it expects whoever wants to use it. Okay, so a class that inherits from the interface is going to have to implement those functionalities, which means in this case, in this example here, you're going to create a class that handles with entity framework, and it will in itself implement those functions. All right, and then if you want to use another data access technology like Dapper, you create another class that will also take that interface. In the end, all you do is just switch the interface. All right, if it's not really making that much sense, just know that an interface is more like a class, but it does not have implementations. He who accepts the contracts being a class will implement those functionalities. Now, at this juncture, I would say enough of the theory. Let's get into code, and let me show you how we can implement dependency injection and repository pattern as far as the model in APIs is concerned. Now let's put all that theory into practice. All right, so one thing that I want you to note is .NET 6 comes already with a dependency injection container. Okay, that's how much Microsoft wants us not to waste time on those things. So we're going to make use of that dependency injection container to register all our dependencies. Okay, but for now, let's focus first on the repository pattern. So the first thing I want you to do is to create a folder called models. Okay, so we're going to click on the project, click add new folder. You're gonna call it models. We're gonna call it models. All right, since we're trying to build a prescription management system, then it's befitting for us to create a prescription class. Again, we're not trying to understand, so you're going to create a new class. We're not trying to understand how prescriptions work. We're just trying to see how APIs work. So our prescription class is going to be a bare minimum. So call that class prescription. Press enter. So it's going to be on a very bare minimum. So all we want is, now, the shortcut here in in Visual Studio, if you put prop, that means the property. So put prop and tab. Once you tab, it's going to ask a forward sum. So the first thing, obviously, we need to have an ID that would be a primary key in a database. So we're going to use what we call code first approach. So we're going to code our model, and then we're going to migrate it. Then it will create for us a database. If you've never done that before, or you're used to the database first approach, don't worry. We're going to go through every step here. So the next step would be to have what we call a name of a patient. So that would be a string. So a string, and you want patient name. We're gonna need to have decimal the amount. So what's the cost of the prescription? We're going to have the frequency in which they have to take the medication. So frequency. All right. I'm getting a squiggly line that says what? Anyway, we'll deal with that later. Okay, so this is basically our class. We've done the ID. This will represent a unique identifier, what you call a primary key in database. So now, since we're going to use a code first approach, we're going to need to give it more description so that once we migrate, it's able to know that these are the things I have to put to my entry database. Now we have what we call data annotation, and we've got the Fluent API, but we're going to use data annotations here because they're simple and easy to implement. So for the ID, you're going to put the word key, and what key does is once you migrate, it will let entry framework know that this is a primary key. Okay. Again, it has to be required. So required just says should it be nullable. All right. For the patient name, you can put things like, it has to be required, obviously. You could put things like max length. You could put 100. Then for the amount, that has to be required as well. It has to be required. So you can also put an error message say amount is required, so that when somebody doesn't give the amount, that's what it returns. You might also want to have, anyway, let's see that for now. Let's just focus on a few things. You could put things like it has to be a positive number, right? But can do that later. So by doing this, we're saying we want you. So when you migrate, the database is going to know that okay, this is a primary key. It's required. It won't be now. Also, when you hit it, when you're hitting the API, it will throw those errors. Okay. So from there, we need to create another module, another class in modules. Call that data. Okay. This is where the interface comes into play. Okay, so we're going to create an interface. We're going to right click, new item, and you're going to select interface. Now an interface by default starts with an I, so it will be an I prescription repository. All right, so you want to give it the functionalities that we want to have here. Okay, so we have 5 functionalities. You want to get all prescriptions. Now when you get all prescriptions, obviously when they come back, it will be a list of prescriptions. So you want to have something that is going to put that in a list. So you want to get back a list of what? A list of prescriptions. All right, so get all. I think I'm using autocomplete AI, so I think it knows what I usually do. So that's the functionality. We want to get a single prescription, so just one prescription. Oh, nice. So it knows exactly what I usually do. So this one is going to get one. The next one would be we want to create a prescription. So obviously we're not going to return anything there. We want to create. Anyway, it said we should. Okay, so You can delete, you can update. So when you update, it gets a prescription, and you can also create. It's gonna get in a prescription, right? So we have this functionality. The first one gives back a list of prescription. The second one, via ID, it gets you a single prescription. The third one deletes. This one updates, that creates. So now we're here. But instead of using these two as classes, we have brought an interface in between, right? So now we want to use either of these technologies to access that data store, right? So what do? We're going to bring that class that will now implement from the interface, okay? But in this video, I don't want to talk to a database straight. I just want to show you the repository pattern, okay? The next video, we're going to run to an actual database, okay? So we're going to use an in-memory list. All right, so I want us to create a class that is going to use this functionality. So go back to data, right click and add a class. Okay, I want you to call that class, let's call it an in-memory repository. And then you note I haven't used I because it's a class, it's not an interface. So the I there is for interface, it's in memory, showing that we're using in memory. Okay, now this class in memory, I can't even spell right. Let me try to refactor that. In memory, right? Yes, refactor please. Okay, so refactored. Now we're saying this class, we want it to be a third layer here. It's not Entity Framework, it's not DAB, it's a third layer that handles that, right? So we want this class to implement whatever I prescription repository have. Okay, now you notice something here. It will tell you it does not implement all those 5, right? So if you click control dot, it will say implement interface. Okay, so what it will do here, it will show you all those five functionalities, but you see all it does is put in exceptions, right? It wants you to do the actual implementation. Okay, so in this case we are saying we want to use a list to access the data, right? So we're going to create a list. So we're going to say valuable. All right, I think it has to be explicit, so we can say private static, and it's static because we want to use it. So if you don't make it static, you're not going to access those things. So list of prescription, call it prescription. Prescriptions is equal to new list of prescriptions, right? Okay, but in this case we want to new up the list. So we're saying a list of prescriptions, right? All right. So we're going to say the first one, ID, is going to be 1. Then we're going to have amount, that could be 200. Then you're going to have frequency, we'll take those 3 times a day. Then you're going to have patient's name. I'll just put codeunparalled, but we're not sick, we're okay. All right, so for the sake of those guys who are on mobiles, I'm gonna try as much as possible to do that. I was complaining, give an M, it's a decimal, so an M just shows that it's a decimal. So we're going to do this 3 times. All right, so this will be done 3 times. There's going to be 2. Put a comma there. It's going to be 500. Who's sick? Well, no one. This is going to be 83. It's going to be at 1000. And who is sick or bad coding practices. Sick, it has to be sick. Okay, so in this case we're saying this is our data store. Okay, so this is our database in our case. In the next video we're going to go to an actual database. So in order for you to get all databases, in order for you to get all prescriptions, you're going to say you want to return, obviously, so you're going to return prescriptions. Okay, now for this I'm going to do just for the get ones because I don't want us to over clutter it. We'll get there shortly. So for you to get an individual prescription, you're going to return prescription and you're going to give an ID. All right, and once you do that, we have implemented the get all and the get prescriptions. So what's next now? The next thing would be for us to go to the program class. And if you remember, this is a class where we attach our services. Okay, if you watch the video on controllers, we said, on APIs, we said this is where we add these things to our dependency injection controller. So this is our dependency injection controller. All right, we're trying to say take this dependency and attach it to that, right? So what we're going to do here, we're going to say fine, you need to build an instance, then you need a service. Okay, then you need to add scoped. Now add scoped, there's add scoped, there's add transient, and there's add, I think, singleton. We're going to use add scoped because add scoped is going to create an instance at runtime, right? So what are we adding to? We're trying to tell this container, whenever you see an iPrescription interface, iPrescription repository, okay, you have to use the in-memory repository. Now this might look confusing, this line. Now let me talk about it. You see, we have a repository, right, which is sitting between here. It is dictating our functionality, but we said an interface does not implement any functionality. He who inherits from it will give you the functionality. In our case, this interface here has just said these are the functionalities I want you to do, right? And this class here has said, you know what, I am going to inherit you and I'm going to implement this functionality. Okay, so now we're telling the dependency injection container, whenever you see iDepository in the code, it doesn't matter where. And the thing is, we're not doing it at one place. Okay, it doesn't matter where you see it, but you have to use this class to do that functionality. Okay, now let's go there real quick and show you how we do it. Now we're gonna go to the prescription controller, and if you recall our snippet here, we said we have to know about our dependencies, right? So in this case, our API controller class is going to depend on that interface for it to access the data. All right, so what do we do first in this controller? We're going to bring a constructor because we're going to use constructor injection. So the shortcut there is CTO. CTO is going to give you the prescription controller. Now what does it depend on? Okay, we need to new up an instance of our repository, okay, because now it will need that to access the data. So we're going to have private read only iPrescription, and I could just copy it from to avoid, so I could just copy from there. So you're going to say iPrescription, control dot to add it, don't forget that, iPrescription prescription repository. All right, you see, so here we have declared our asset. We will need this in order for the controller to access the model, okay? But also we have to give it that model here, okay? So we're going to say prescription repository and prescription repository. Now you see something here. You see that this has an underscore, this has an underscore, this doesn't have an underscore. That's just the pattern in C# we use. And I also did over there, okay? Then here you're going to say, I want my prescription to equal that. So you have newed it up, exactly what we did there. All right. So now we have this controller has the access. Okay, it has the access to the database, to the data access layer. Okay. So now if we come to this get method which you had earlier, which is get all we have to do is, well, I'm gonna use my repository and dot. It knows exactly what I'm gonna use get all. All right. And you could put this into a variable called prescriptions. So all you're saying is, I am going to use that interface. Okay. So when the DA container sees this, it will go to the program class and say, oh, there's this. I'm going to use that class for my implementation. All right. Now this area is coming on because we have to use API responses, right? Not responses, rather. So in APIs, in RESTful APIs, so I'm going to put action result. Action result. So in APIs, we want to give information to whoever is consuming that will make sense to them, right? So in our case, if, okay, so if prescriptions is equal to null, then we need to tell the one who's consuming the API that it wasn't found, okay? Otherwise, I want you to return, you're gonna return okay. Okay, so we're gonna return okay. You're gonna give it the prescription. Okay. Now let's run this, then I'll walk you through again. Again, I'm gonna press Ctrl F5 and it'll take us to our browser, and finally it loads. So we have just one function, one get function in that. So if I am going to try it out and click get all, you're gonna notice that lo and behold, everything comes up. Okay. All right. Now, as a recap, what have we done? For those that might still be confused, we have said our class, okay, has dependencies. In this case, that class is our controller. It has a dependency on a class that needs to access data. So it needs that class in order to access the data. All right. But in our case, we said we're not going to use a class. We're going to use an interface to avoid tightly coupling. So our controller relies on an interface. Okay. What have we done? We have newed up the interface and given it to it. Okay. By doing this, we have done our dependency injection, and we have access to everything that gives us. All right. Fine. Then we've seen repository. We've said for us to talk to a data store without being tied to a data access technology, we need to have an interface. Okay, so we've created an interface with the functionality. Okay, then we have said, okay, fine, we want to use an in-memory data store. Then we've created a class, but that class has to inherit from the interface in order for it to provide this functionality. And that class has showed us the functionality, has implemented the functionality, albeit we've done just two, has shown us the functionality that is needed. All right, then we said, fine, since Microsoft has created a dependency injection container, it means we'll do this thing only on one place. We've said we've come to this program CS class to say whenever you see iPrescription repository, well, use that class. Okay. Now this is important because if I'm to swap and use entity framework, all I'll do is change this one line of code and everything functions. Hence, we are not tied to a specific data access or ORM. All right, then here we've just tried it out and it's actually working. So I know it's been a very, very long video, but if you've stayed with me this far, trust me, you just learned a lot, and this will change your life forever. If you like the content, if it gives you value, if it gives you, please subscribe, share it with your friends, like, comment, and let's keep the ball rolling. And in our next video, we're going to see how we're going to bring the data access part to it, and we'll simply just change this line to use that. Anyway, thanks again from Code Unparalled, and do have a lovely day.